My name is Riley Morgan. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked behind conference room doors that rarely had my name on them. On paper, I was a compliance operations manager for a mid-sized tech consulting firm in Chicago. In reality, I was the person people came to when something went wrong and they needed it fixed quietly. Contracts that didn't quite align, vendor agreements that had been rushed, minor clauses that no one had read closely enough. I was the one who read them. Most people who met me for the first time didn't register me as a threat to anything. I'm not loud. I don't interrupt. I don't perform intelligence. I listen. I take notes. I ask one or two questions, usually at the end, when everyone else thinks the meeting is already finished. That was the version of me they understood. Reliable, calm, administrative, useful. They didn't see the other version. They didn't see that I remembered every offhand comment, every shift in tone, every time someone reassigned risk in a sentence so smooth that it almost sounded reasonable. They didn't see that while they were talking over me, I was learning how they thought. This story begins on the Thursday afternoon when I opened the company's legal notice and saw my name listed as the sole responsible party. No one had warned me. No one had prepared me. And the two executives who had negotiated and signed the deal together had made sure of one thing. When the lawsuit landed, it would land on me alone. They signed the deal together, but made sure I would face the lawsuit alone. If you're expecting a dramatic courtroom scene or some explosive revenge, that's not what this is. There was no shouting, no public humiliation, no miraculous twist. This is a story about documentation, about silence, about patience. It's about how someone can slowly be positioned as a shield without realizing it at first. And what happens when the shield quietly decides it will no longer absorb the impact. I won't pretend I handled everything perfectly. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I rationalized things that didn't deserve rationalizing. I believed that competence would protect me. It didn't, but what happened after that legal notice? That part was deliberate. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you how I was perceived, how the role was built around me piece by piece, and how I stepped out of it, not with anger, but with clarity. This isn't a story about destroying anyone. It's about reclaiming authorship of your own name. Have you ever realized too late that you were the only one carrying a weight that everyone else had agreed you should bear? Before the legal notice, before my name was isolated in black ink, I was Riley from compliance. That was how they introduced me in meetings. Not Riley Morgan, not the person who reviewed every vendor agreement before signature, not the one who caught the liability clause buried on page 42 that saved the company nearly $500,000 the year before. Just Riley from compliance. I sat at the far end of long tables, near the screen, but slightly outside the cluster of decision makers. The executives, Daniel and Mark, usually positioned themselves in the center. They were charismatic in different ways. Daniel was polished and reassuring. Mark was sharp, quick, always finishing other people's sentences. I rarely finished mine, not because I couldn't, because I learned early that finishing them didn't change anything. When I spoke, it was usually after everyone else had expressed enthusiasm. I would clear my throat lightly and say something like, just one clarification on indemnification. Or, we may want to revisit section 8.3 regarding assumption of risk. The room would shift subtly, not hostile, just impatient. Daniel would smile in a way that looked supportive but felt dismissive. Good catch, Riley. We'll tighten that up. We rarely did, and yet I kept showing up prepared. I created internal risk summaries that no one asked for. I mapped out exposure scenarios in spreadsheets that I never circulated unless prompted. I color-coded obligations by department, even when no one acknowledged that I was effectively building a second safety net beneath their optimism. They trusted me, but in a specific way. They trusted that I would handle whatever they overlooked. If a client questioned a clause, it came to me. If a vendor pushed back, it came to me. If timelines were unrealistic and compliance checkpoints were skipped, I was expected to retrofit protection after the fact. I wasn't in the spotlight. I was the quiet adjustment behind it. Over time, I began to notice something subtle. My presence in meetings became less about input and more about reassurance. When I nodded, deals moved forward. When I didn't object strongly enough, it was interpreted as consent. No one explicitly said the Riley will take responsibility, but the structure implied it. Email threads would end with, looping Riley in to finalize. Riley, can you confirm we're covered? Riley will own documentation. Own. It's an interesting word. Ownership sounds empowering until you realize it can also mean absorbing fallout. I don't think they saw me as weak. That would be too simple. They saw me as stable, predictable. the person who wouldn't cause friction. And I didn't, partly because I believed in the company, partly because I believed competence earned protection, mostly because I was used to being the responsible one, the oldest daughter, the peacemaker, the one who stayed calm when other people escalated. In corporate environments, that trait is often rewarded. Until it isn't. By the time the deal that would later implode crossed my desk, my role had already been defined, without a formal title change, without a discussion. I was the buffer, the absorber, the quiet insurance policy no one formally acknowledged, but everyone relied on. And the most dangerous part? I had begun to accept that as normal. Looking back, the first sign wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a shouting match or a public dismissal. It was a sentence spoken casually, almost affectionately. We were reviewing a new partnership agreement with an overseas vendor. It wasn't the deal that would later unravel everything, but it followed the same pattern. Aggressive growth timeline, ambitious deliverables, very optimistic projections. I had flagged 2 clauses the night before. One shifted liability for third-party data breaches in a way that felt asymmetrical. The other allowed accelerated payment triggers if milestones were substantially met. A phrase vague enough to stretch. When I mentioned it in the meeting, I kept my tone neutral. I'm concerned that substantially met doesn't give us enough protection if deliverables are incomplete. Mark leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head. You always find something scary in every contract, Riley. He said it with a half smile. The room chuckled softly. Not cruelly, just enough. I smiled back, because that's what you do when you don't want to be seen as defensive. I don't think it's scary, I replied calmly. Just ambiguous. Daniel stepped in, smoothing the air. We appreciate the diligence, but we can't stall every deal over hypotheticals. Hypotheticals. That word stayed with me, because my job wasn't built on hypotheticals. It was built on patterns, on watching how unlikely risks became very real liabilities 6 months later. But in that room, my caution became personality. Not analysis, not expertise, just Riley being Riley. The meeting moved on. They signed the agreement with minor edits, none addressing the clauses I'd raised. A few weeks later, when deliverables slipped and the vendor triggered the accelerated payment clause, it landed on my desk to sort out. No one referenced that earlier meeting. No one said, "You were right." Instead, the narrative shifted subtly. Riley, can you handle this? Riley, can you work your compliance magic? Riley, we trust you. Trust. It's a beautiful word when it comes with authority. It's heavier when it comes with cleanup. That was the first small cut, not the ignored clause. The reframing. My professional assessment became cautionary noise. Their optimism became leadership. And when the optimism cost something, my role wasn't to question it, it was to absorb it. What struck me most wasn't that they dismissed my concern. It was that no one else in the room reacted. No one said, "Let her finish." No one asked for deeper clarification. The group dynamic was smooth, efficient, unified, and I didn't want to be the one person disrupting momentum. So I adjusted. I began softening my language even more. Instead of "this exposes us," I would say, "we may want to consider." Instead of "this clause is risky," I would say, "there could be implications." I told myself I was being collaborative, but in reality, I was adapting to a subtle social contract. Your role is to flag lightly, not to insist. That first small cut didn't bleed visibly. It just created a template. From that day forward, when I raised a concern, it was met with patience rather than engagement, appreciation rather than action. I was the responsible one, and responsible people, I learned, are often expected to manage consequences quietly, because they always have before. I didn't confront it. I didn't escalate. I made a mental note in the back of my black leather notebook. Clause flagged, dismissed, outcome predictable. I didn't know yet how important those notes would become. At the time, it just felt like another Thursday. The thing about subtle dismissal is that it rarely arrives alone. It repeats. Not loudly, not dramatically, just often enough that you begin adjusting yourself before anyone has to adjust you. After that first contract incident, something shifted in the rhythm of meetings. It wasn't that I stopped speaking, it was then that I began calculating the cost of speaking. I noticed how enthusiasm was contagious in the room, but caution wasn't. When Daniel leaned forward, energized by a new proposal, the energy spread. When I leaned forward, pointing out structural exposure, the air flattened. Not hostile, just inconvenient. So I started timing my comments differently. I would wait until the end of the meeting, when decisions had already been verbally agreed upon. I'd frame my concerns as implementation details rather than strategic objections. That way, I wasn't blocking momentum. That's what I told myself. One afternoon, during early negotiations as for what would later become the disastrous deal, I received a draft agreement from Mark with a brief message. Looks clean, should be straightforward, let's move fast. I read it that evening at my kitchen table, page by page, line by line, and I felt that quiet tightening in my chest, the one I'd come to recognize as instinct. There were structural issues, not accidental ones. The indemnification language placed downstream liability on the acting compliance officer overseeing execution, not the executive signatories, not the board. The acting compliance officer, which operationally was me. It wasn't explicit. It was layered, conditional, buried in definitions and cross-references. Someone skimming wouldn't notice. Someone reading carefully would. The next morning, I drafted a summary outlining the risk allocation concerns. I attached annotated excerpts and suggested revisions. Mark replied within 7 minutes. Appreciate the thoroughness, but this is standard positioning. Legal already glanced at it. Glanced. I sat with that word longer than I should have. When we discussed it in person, I explained calmly that the clause created asymmetric exposure, that in the event of a breach, responsibility could be interpreted as operational rather than executive. Daniel waved it off gently. Riley, you're overthinking it. That language is boilerplate. It won't hold in a real dispute. Won't hold. That was the second cut. Not because they disagreed, but because they didn't engage with the substance. My caution became overthinking. My analysis became personal. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, I began questioning my own calibration. Maybe I was too conservative. Maybe this was how aggressive growth worked. Maybe my job wasn't to push back. It was to manage the aftermath. I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to be seen as resistant to expansion. So I did what competent, conflict-averse professionals often do. I rationalized. I told myself that executives assume risk. That's their role. I told myself the company would never isolate one person in a real legal scenario. I told myself my name appearing in operational language didn't mean personal liability. After all, this was a team, right? But I kept annotating. I kept printing drafts and circling phrases in pencil. I kept saving versions with timestamps. I kept forwarding certain approvals back to myself, so they lived in a separate archive folder. Not because I planned anything, because something in me no longer trusted the air in the room. Disrespect doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like consistent minimization, a steady pattern of you worry too much. It's fine. We've got it. Until one day it lands somewhere very specific, and everyone acts surprised. At that stage, I was still trying to believe I was imagining the imbalance. I wanted to believe that when pressure came, we would stand evenly. I hadn't yet opened the envelope that would prove otherwise. There's a moment, quiet, almost administrative, when you realize a role has been assigned to you without a formal conversation. No promotion, no title change, just expectation. By the time the deal moved into final negotiation stages, I had become something very specific inside the company. Not a strategist, not a decision maker. A safeguard? If Daniel and Mark were the visible architects of expansion, I was the structural reinforcement. Invisible, necessary, replaceable. I began noticing how my name was used in conversations I wasn't present for. I would receive forwarded emails that read, "Compliance has been reviewed." Riley signed off. "We're covered." Sometimes I had reviewed, sometimes I hadn't. And when I corrected the phrasing, subtly, politely, the response was always reassuring. Of course, we just meant generally. Generally, it was fascinating how that word carried so much weight. In leadership meetings, Daniel often described me as our internal risk compass. It sounded complimentary. It positioned me as essential. But a compass doesn't steer the ship. It just points. And if the captain chooses to sail into a storm anyway, no one blames the compass, unless the paperwork says otherwise. As the deal documentation evolved, I noticed something else. Tasks began consolidating around me. Operational oversight, compliance validation, vendor communication checkpoints, final documentation routing. All roads, administratively, ran through my desk. On paper, it looked efficient. In reality, it created a funnel. And funnels are dangerous when pressure builds. One afternoon, during a strategy sync, I overheard something that clarified everything. Mark was speaking to a potential partner on speakerphone. Daniel was beside him. I was there to answer technical compliance questions if needed. At one point, the partner asked, "Who's accountable for execution on your side?" Mark didn't hesitate. "Our compliance lead, Riley, oversees operational responsibility." I remember writing that exact phrase in my notebook, because that wasn't how it had ever been formally defined. After the call, I approached Daniel calmly. "Just for clarity," I said, keeping my voice even. "When we describe operational responsibility externally, are we positioning that as compliance-owned?" He smiled, the way someone does when they believe you're worrying unnecessarily. It's just optics, Riley. Clients feel safer knowing there's a dedicated oversight role. Optics. There it was again. Language used to smooth edges. I didn't argue. I didn't escalate. But that evening, I went home and reread the evolving contract with a different lens. Not as a compliance manager protecting the company, but as a named entity protecting herself. And I saw it clearly then. They weren't consciously setting me up, not in a cartoon villain way. They were optimizing. Optimizing speed. Optimizing liability distribution. Optimizing narrative control. And in that optimization process, the most stable person in the room became the safest container for risk. Me, I had been assigned the role of absorber. Reliable, competent, quiet. The kind of person who would never publicly object. The kind of person who would fix things discreetly. The kind of person who wouldn't make noise. It wasn't malicious. It was structural. And structures, once built, don't question themselves. People inside them just perform their roles. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me still, because once you understand the role you've been cast in, you have two choices: continue performing, or step out of character. At that point, I hadn't stepped out yet, but for the first time, I was aware I was on stage. The shift didn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen during a heated discussion or a dramatic revelation. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening, long after everyone else had left the office. The building was almost silent. The kind of silence that feels neutral, not peaceful. Fluorescent lights are humming softly, city reflections stretching across the glass walls. I was alone in the conference room with the finalized version of the contract, the one they were signing the next morning. Daniel had already sent the celebratory email draft to leadership. Mark had texted me earlier. Big win, appreciate you keeping everything tight. Keeping everything tight. I sat at the long table, my black notebook open beside the printed agreement. I wasn't reviewing it to change anything. It was too late for that. I was reviewing it to understand something. Page 38. The indemnification clause had been slightly reworded from the previous draft. Subtle, almost elegant. Responsibility for operational compliance oversight and execution validation was explicitly defined as assigned to the acting compliance officer designated within the internal governance structure. My name was not printed there, but my position was singular. There was no ambiguity about who held that role. I felt the now familiar tightening in my chest, but this time something else accompanied it. Clarity, not panic, not fear, just clarity. I imagined calmly a scenario where this partnership failed. A breach, a missed deliverable, a regulatory issue. I traced the flow of accountability through the document. It didn't end with Daniel. It didn't end with Mark. It funneled toward me. I leaned back in the chair and looked at the skyline outside. For years, I had operated under the assumption that being indispensable meant being protected. That competence created safety. That if you consistently carried weight for others, they would instinctively redistribute it when it became too heavy. But contracts don't run on instinct. They run on language, and language had quietly positioned me at the bottom of the liability pyramid. That was the moment something inside me shifted, not into anger, into detachment. I realized I had been playing two roles at once, loyal employee and unspoken shield, and the second role had never been explicitly agreed to. I thought about every meeting where I softened my tone, every time I accepted its standard as a sufficient explanation, every time I rationalized staying quiet to maintain harmony. Harmony for whom? The fluorescent lights flickered slightly as the timer adjusted for evening mode. I remember that detail vividly. It felt symbolic, though I'm not someone who usually thinks that way. I closed the contract slowly. For the first time, I stopped asking, how do I protect the company? And started asking, how do I protect myself within the company? That question changed everything, because once self-preservation enters the frame, silence stops being passive. It becomes strategic. I didn't confront anyone the next day. I didn't refuse to sign off on execution workflows. I didn't send dramatic emails highlighting exposure. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, the role dissolved. I was no longer the shield. I was an observer inside the structure. And observers see patterns differently. The deal was signed the next morning. They shook hands. They congratulated each other. They called it a milestone. I smiled for the photo. But I was no longer assuming that the structure would protect me. From that day forward, I began preparing, not for conflict, but for inevitability. Because once you see the design clearly, you stop being surprised by how it functions. You start planning for when it does. After the contract was signed, something about my silence changed. Before, it had been adaptive. A way to keep meetings smooth. A way to avoid being labeled as obstructive. Now it was deliberate. I still attended every strategy call. I still reviewed every implementation document. I still responded promptly when Daniel forwarded emails with, "Riley, confirm we're aligned." But I stopped softening language for their comfort. If something was risky, I documented it plainly in writing, not dramatically, not emotionally, just clearly. Per our discussion, Clause 8.3 allocates operational liability to compliance oversight. Confirming this aligns with executive risk acceptance. That became my tone. Precise, neutral, time-stamped. They didn't notice at first. Why would they? From the outside, I looked exactly the same, calm, professional, unreactive. But internally, I had drawn a line. I no longer believed reassurance was protection. Documentation was. In meetings, when Mark would wave off a concern, I didn't push verbally. I would nod once and say, "Understood," and then follow up with a recap email summarizing the risk acknowledgement. At first, he responded casually, "Yep, we're good. Sounds fine. Appreciate you tracking." They interpreted my calmness as agreement. They mistook precision for compliance. That was the advantage of being underestimated. When people see you as steady and non-confrontational, they don't anticipate strategy. They assume continuation. Meanwhile, I began organizing something quietly. Every draft version of the contract is archived. Every email chain discussing risk allocation is duplicated. Every message where I flagged concern and received dismissal saved. Not in a dramatic secret vault, just in a structured folder with clear naming conventions. Date, topic, decision owner. I wasn't building a case. I was building clarity. There's a difference. I also adjusted something else, verbal responsibility. When external partners asked about execution, I began answering differently. Operational compliance support will be provided by my department. Strategic risk acceptance remains with executive leadership. It was subtle, but intentional. Daniel noticed once. After a call, he said lightly, "You're being very technical with phrasing lately." I met his eyes calmly. "Just ensuring alignment." He nodded, unconcerned, because to him, nothing had changed. To me, everything had. Silence, when chosen consciously, becomes powerful. It gives you time. It gives you observation space. It removes the emotional reactivity that clouds long-term thinking. I stopped trying to convince them. I stopped trying to be heard in the room. Instead, I started preparing for a room that didn't exist yet. One where language would matter more than charisma. One where tone would be irrelevant. One where signatures would outweigh smiles. The interesting thing about strategic silence is that it unsettles no one until the outcome arrives. They continued celebrating the deal's early momentum. Revenue projections looked promising. Internal updates framed it as a flagship partnership, and I continued performing my role, but I no longer internalized their optimism. I evaluated exposure independently. I tracked missed milestones. I noted deviations between projected and actual performance. I made no accusations. I issued no warnings beyond what was professionally required. Because at that point, I understood something they didn't. When the structure shifts under pressure, whoever is formally positioned at the base absorbs the weight. And I was quietly repositioning myself, not visibly, not dramatically, but legally. Silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was timing. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks consistent. After the deal launched, everyone's attention shifted to growth metrics. Revenue dashboards, client testimonials, expansion opportunities. My attention shifted somewhere else. Process trails. I began mapping decision pathways. Not because I expected collapse, but because I no longer trusted memory, especially not collective memory. Collective memory has a way of reshaping itself under pressure. I created a private document titled Execution Accountability Flow. It wasn't accusatory, it was structural. For every milestone in the contract, I outlined who proposed it, who approved it, who acknowledged risk, who executed it, who benefited from it. The pattern was consistent. Strategic acceleration came from Daniel and Mark. Operational caution came from me. Final approval always flowed upward. And yet, formal documentation increasingly concentrates execution language downward, toward compliance, toward me. I didn't confront it. I categorized it. There's something grounding about categorization. It transforms vague unease into visible architecture. I also began strengthening my knowledge in ways no one asked for. I scheduled quiet consultations with external legal advisors under the pretext of professional development. I asked theoretical questions about liability language, about indemnification interpretation, about how courts evaluate operational oversight clauses. I never mentioned my company by name. I didn't need to. The patterns were common enough. One attorney said something that stayed with me. Responsibility follows documented authority, but liability follows documented assignment. That distinction mattered. Authority and assignment are not the same. I reviewed our internal governance structure. There was no formal document designating me as the sole risk bearer, but there were repeated communications framing me as the execution lead. Framing, over time, becomes narrative. Narrative under dispute becomes evidence. They never noticed that my meeting notes had become more detailed. They never noticed that I began sending summary recaps after verbal approvals. They never noticed that when someone said, "Let's just move forward," I would reply, confirming this is an executive decision with compliance noted objection. It sounded procedural. It was protective. I also did something else, something quieter. I updated my resume, not because I planned to leave immediately, but because psychological independence matters. When you know you can walk away, your posture changes. You stop negotiating from fear. Meanwhile, cracks began appearing in the partnership. Missed deliverables, scope drift, unmet performance benchmarks. Nothing catastrophic, just erosion. Every time an issue surfaced, Mark would say, "Riley, can you stabilize this?" And I would respond calmly, "I can document it. Notice the shift. Don't fix it. Document it." They interpreted that as process management. It was positioning, because documentation creates timeline clarity, and timeline clarity prevents retrospective rewriting. There was one meeting in particular I remember vividly. The partner raised concerns about implementation delays and hinted at contractual remedies. Daniel reassured them smoothly. Mark promised adjustments. Then all eyes turned to me. "Riley oversees compliance. We're in good hands." I met the partner's gaze through the screen. My role is to ensure contractual alignment. Strategic remedies remain executive decisions. The call ended without friction. Afterward, Daniel laughed lightly. "You're very precise lately." I smiled. "I've always been precise." He didn't disagree, because he still believed precision served him. What they never noticed was that I had stopped absorbing emotional responsibility for outcomes I didn't control. I no longer internalized their optimism. I no longer compensated for their speed. I became a recorder of reality. And reality, when pressure builds, becomes invaluable. By the time the first formal dispute letter arrived from the partner, I wasn't surprised. I was ready, not emotionally, structurally, because while they were celebrating growth, I had been building a map. And maps matter when the ground starts to move. The legal notice arrived on a Thursday. It was delivered both electronically and by certified mail. Formal, structured, common tone. That's how serious conflict usually presents itself. Not with shouting, but with formatting. I opened the email first. Subject line: Notice of breach and intent to pursue legal remedy. My eyes moved methodically through the paragraphs. Failure to meet performance benchmarks. Financial damages. Contractual liability under Section 8.3. Section 8.3. I didn't feel panic. I felt recognition. Then I reached the paragraph that altered the atmosphere completely. Pursuant to the defined assignment of operational compliance oversight, responsibility rests with the acting compliance officer overseeing execution validation. No executive names were listed, only the role, and in our internal governance documentation, that role was mapped singularly to me. I closed my office door before opening the printed copy of the notice that had arrived downstairs. Seeing your exposure in ink feels different than reading it on a screen. Ink is final. For a moment, I allowed myself one honest breath of emotion. Not anger, not fear, just the acknowledgement of inevitability. They signed the deal together, but made sure I would face the lawsuit alone. Except they hadn't consciously made sure. They had simply allowed language to accumulate in a direction convenient for momentum. Convenient until it wasn't. I didn't call Daniel immediately. I didn't forward the notice with a reactive message. Instead, I opened my private archive. Draft versions of the contract, emails summarizing risk acknowledgement, meeting recaps where I had documented objections, external legal consultation notes. I cross-referenced the indemnification language across versions. There it was, the earlier draft, where liability had been broader, less targeted. My annotated suggestion to adjust the assignment language. Mark's response dismissed the concern. Daniel's follow-up stated, "We accept this structure." Accept. That word is powerful in writing. I then reviewed internal governance documents. There was no board resolution formally designating me as a personal risk bearer, no compensation adjustment for executive-level exposure, no indemnity protection for operational roles beyond standard employee coverage, which meant something important. The narrative could point downward, but the decision chain pointed upward. That was the private reveal. Not that they had positioned me as a shield, but they had done so without fully fortifying the structure. They assumed no one would examine the architecture closely. They assumed I wouldn't. In that moment, I realized I had leverage, not in a dramatic sense, but in a factual one. I possessed documented objections, time-stamped acknowledgments, clear differentiation between strategic acceptance and operational execution, evidence that I had consistently flagged allocation concerns. There was no need for confrontation. There was no need for revenge. There was simply alignment. If responsibility follows assignment, then assignment must be examined in full context. I drafted a calm internal memo. Subject line: alignment review, liability assignment and decision authority. I did not accuse. I did not react. I outlined the clause in question, the documented evolution of its wording, my prior written objections, the executive confirmations accepting risk, and I ended with one sentence. Given the formal notice received, we will need to review accountability in alignment with documented decision authority. No emotion, no blame, just structure. Before sending it, I paused, not out of hesitation, out of clarity. This was the moment where silence transitioned into action. Not loud action, not public action, but irreversible. I pressed send, and then I waited, because when documentation enters the room, the temperature changes. Not immediately, but inevitably. After I sent the memo, the office atmosphere shifted, but only slightly at first. Daniel responded within 20 minutes. Let's regroup as a leadership team and align on next steps. Align, another carefully chosen word. Mark's reply followed shortly after. Agreed, no need to overcomplicate this. We'll handle it. We? It was interesting how the language changed once the word liability entered the conversation formally. The emergency meeting was scheduled for that afternoon. I walked into the conference room with the same black notebook I had always carried. Same blazer, same calm posture. From the outside, I looked unchanged. Inside, I was measuring options, because this was the real decision point, not the legal notice itself. I had 3 paths. The first was familiar: absorb quietly, allow them to frame it as an operational oversight failure, trust that internal resolution would protect my role, even if it bruised my reputation. The second was confrontational, challenge them directly in the room, lay out the documentation aggressively, force acknowledgement in a way that cornered them. The third was quieter and irreversible, escalate formally, not emotionally, not publicly, but structurally, request written clarification of executive risk acceptance. Engage external counsel under personal advisement. Trigger internal governance review protocols. The first option would preserve harmony. The second would create spectacle. The third would change the power structure. When the meeting began, Daniel took the lead. "This is manageable," he said smoothly. "We just need to show good faith remediation." Mark nodded. "The clause references compliance oversight. Riley will need you to coordinate the response." There it was, subtle, immediate, the reflex to funnel. I listened without interrupting. When they finished outlining their proposed response strategy, one that positioned the issue as an execution gap rather than a structural risk acceptance, I opened my notebook. "I need clarification," I said evenly. They both looked at me. "Specifically, I need written confirmation of executive acceptance of liability allocation as documented in prior correspondence." Silence. Not hostile. Just recalibrating. Daniel smiled slightly. "Of course, we're aligned. There's no finger-pointing here." "I'm not discussing finger-pointing," I replied calmly. "I'm discussing documented accountability." Mark shifted in his seat. "Riley, we're a team. Let's not get defensive." Defensive. The predictable reframing. I didn't react. "I'm not defensive, I'm procedural." That was the moment I made my decision. Not because they were cruel, not because they were shouting, but because even now, even with formal notice in hand, the instinct was to let language blur again, to let responsibility drift downward through phrasing. I wouldn't allow that. After the meeting, I sent a follow-up email summarizing the discussion and requesting formal executive acknowledgement of strategic risk acceptance at the time of contract execution. Then I did something they didn't anticipate. I retained independent counsel, not to sue anyone, not to escalate externally, but to review my personal exposure. That was the irreversible step. Once you involve an independent legal review, you are no longer playing the internal harmony game. You are operating on documented terrain. I didn't announce it. I didn't threaten. I simply ensured that any response drafted in my name would be reviewed through a lens that protected me first. Because I finally understood something fundamental. Loyalty without boundaries is liability, and silence without documentation is surrender. They believed we were still handling this internally. They didn't realize the structure had shifted. I was no longer inside the funnel. I had stepped slightly to the side. And from that position, everything looked different. Once I retained independent counsel, my posture didn't change. That was important. No sudden distance, no visible defensiveness, no dramatic withdrawal from meetings. If anything, I became even more composed. My attorney, Elena, was precise, efficient, and unemotional. When I laid out the documentation trail, she didn't react with outrage. She reacted with analysis. "This isn't about who feels responsible," she said. It's about who is documented as accepting risk. She reviewed the contract evolution, the email threads, the meeting recaps, the governance structure. You did something very smart, she added calmly. You differentiated operational support from strategic acceptance in writing, repeatedly. Smart, that word felt different than overthinking. Under her guidance, I began adjusting small but critical things. First, any formal response to the partner's legal notice would not go out under my sole name. If my title was referenced, it would be alongside executive authorization. Second, internal documentation would explicitly restate that execution oversight did not equal liability assumption. Third, my employment agreement would be reviewed for indemnification protection clauses. I didn't tell Daniel or Mark about Elena. I didn't need to. Everything I did was procedural. When the draft response letter to the partner circulated internally, I noticed the signature block. Riley Morgan, Compliance Operations Lead, no executive co-signature. I replied calmly, given the referenced liability allocation, response should reflect executive authorization and strategic ownership alignment. It was worded neutrally, but it forced a structural adjustment. The revised draft included Daniel's signature. Mark's name appeared in the authorization header. No commentary accompanied the change. But I felt it, a slight shift in gravity. Meanwhile, I continued tracking internal conversations. There were subtle attempts to reframe narrative. This was an implementation gap. Compliance should have caught the timing issue. We relied on oversight. Every time that language appeared, I responded with clarity. Timeline adjustments were executed following the executive directive dated March 12th. Scope expansion approved in Leadership Sync April 3rd. Risk of acceleration acknowledged in email chain May 6th. Not defensive. Documented. It's remarkable how quickly tone changes when memory is replaced with timestamps. Externally, the partner escalated formally. They referenced financial damages. They requested mediation. Internally, tension increased, but quietly. No shouting, no accusations, just longer pauses in meetings. More careful phrasing. Daniel stopped using "we're covered" as casually. Mark stopped saying, "Riley will own it." Instead, he would say, "Let's align on ownership." Language had become deliberate because they sensed something. They sensed that I was no longer absorbing ambiguity. What they didn't know was that Elena had advised one more protective step. Document any attempt to assign unilateral responsibility retroactively. So when HR requested a summary of my role in the deal, I provided a detailed, timeline-based report highlighting decision authority layers, ICCD legal. That was intentional. Still, I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't escalate emotionally. I simply ensured that every pathway of responsibility was illuminated. Silence can be powerful, but silence paired with structure is immovable. By the time mediation discussions were scheduled, the internal narrative had shifted from compliance oversight failure to collective strategic exposure. Collective. That word hadn't appeared in weeks. Now it was everywhere. No one acknowledged the shift directly, but I felt it in the way Daniel now asked, "How do we approach this together?" Together. The funnel had widened, not because I demanded it, because I documented it. And once documentation is undeniable, structures adjust. Quietly, consequences rarely announce themselves. They arrive as small recalibrations. After mediation was formally requested, the company's internal tone shifted from confident to cautious. Revenue projections were revised downward. Expansion conversations paused. No one said, "This is because of the liability exposure," but everyone felt it. Cash flow tightened. Hiring slowed. And for the first time since the deal had been celebrated as a flagship partnership, Daniel stopped referring to it in town hall meetings. It simply disappeared from slides. That's how organizations process discomfort. They edit visibility. Meanwhile, the partner's legal team requested full documentation of contract evolution and decision authority. This was the moment I had prepared for. I provided materials through official channels, nothing more, nothing less, cleanly organized, chronological, neutral. Draft versions showing clause evolution. Email chains confirming executive acceptance. Meeting recaps distinguishing operational execution from strategic risk. There was no commentary attached, just structure. The impact inside the company was subtle but unmistakable. Daniel began spending more time in closed-door meetings with outside counsel. Mark's tone became less sharp, more measured. At one leadership sync, I noticed something I hadn't seen before: hesitation. When discussing another potential expansion deal, Daniel paused and asked, "Have we reviewed liability distribution thoroughly?" It was the first time he had used that phrasing without prompting. Mark glanced briefly in my direction, not accusing, not resentful, just aware. They were beginning to understand that language has weight, and that weight redistributes when examined. HR scheduled a formal review of governance structures to ensure clarity moving forward. That review included a reassessment of how operational roles were described in external contracts. No one referenced my memo from weeks earlier, but its fingerprint was there. More importantly, the mediation posture changed. Instead of positioning the issue as an execution oversight under compliance, the company began presenting it as a strategic acceleration decision made at the executive level, with operational support noted. Strategic acceleration. That was new. Collective exposure. Also new. No one apologized to me. No one admitted anything. That wasn't the nature of corporate environments. But the structure had shifted. The most telling moment came during a mediation prep session. External counsel asked directly, "Who made the decision to proceed with Clause 8.3 as written?" There was a brief silence. Then Daniel spoke. "I did." He didn't look at me when he said it. He didn't need to. That sentence altered the gravitational field of the room. Because once decision authority is verbally acknowledged, it becomes difficult to redirect responsibility elsewhere. After that meeting, Daniel stopped introducing me as our risk compass. Instead, he said, "Riley ensures compliance alignment." Subtle, but meaningful. The consequences weren't explosive. They were redistributive. Responsibility began climbing back up the chain it had quietly descended. Internally, the company had to allocate reserves to address potential settlement costs. Bonuses were adjusted, forecasts were recalibrated. And for the first time, I was not positioned as the absorber of institutional error. I was positioned as what I had always been, an operational lead within a hierarchy of decision-makers. The irony wasn't lost on me. The structure hadn't collapsed. It had been corrected. Not because of confrontation, not because of anger, but because silence had been paired with documentation, because precision had replaced accommodation. They were beginning to feel the weight, not as punishment, as accuracy. And accuracy is neutral. It doesn't attack, it reveals. By the time mediation formally began, the internal scramble had already peaked. Not outwardly, no one was running through hallways, no raised voices behind glass doors. But the emails came faster, the calendar filled tighter. The language became careful, almost rehearsed. What struck me most wasn't panic. It was a revision. Daniel began revisiting old conversations in subtle ways. "I think there may have been a misunderstanding in how that clause evolved." Mark once said, "We probably should have slowed down at that stage." Probably. Should have. Language of hindsight, but documentation doesn't bend toward hindsight. It anchors itself to timestamps. There was one closed-door meeting I'll never forget. It was just the three of us. Daniel sat at the head of the table. Mark is beside him, me across. The air wasn't hostile. It was heavy. Daniel spoke first. "We need to present a unified front in mediation." Unified. I nodded once, agreed. Mark leaned forward slightly. But part of that unity means not overemphasizing internal disagreements in documentation. There it was, not an accusation, not a demand, a request for softening. I met his gaze calmly. My documentation reflects factual alignment requests at the time decisions were made. He held my eyes for a second longer than usual. "We were moving fast." "Yes," I said, "but we were." Silence. That silence felt different from earlier months. Before, silence meant they assumed I would adjust. Now, silence meant they understood I wouldn't. Daniel shifted in his chair. "No one is trying to assign this to you unfairly." I let that sentence sit in the room, because it was the closest anyone had come to acknowledging what had nearly happened. "I'm not assigning it to anyone," I replied evenly. "I'm aligning it with documented authority." That was the moment they realized something irreversible. The narrative could not be retroactively smoothed. The early email dismissals, the explicit acceptance of clause language, the acceleration directives, they were fixed in writing. Too late to rewrite, too late to reposition me as the sole absorber, and perhaps most importantly, too late to rely on my silence as a cushion. After that meeting, something shifted permanently in how they treated me. Not colder, not hostile, more careful. My emails were read more thoroughly. My recaps received more deliberate responses. Risk discussions included me earlier, not as a formality, but as a factor. But the dynamic we once had, where optimism flowed freely, and I quietly buffered it, that was gone. Trust had not broken. Illusion had. Mediation concluded with a negotiated settlement. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was significant. The company absorbed the financial impact at the executive level. Board oversight tightened. Governance documents were revised. Liability clauses were restructured moving forward. And nowhere, in any official outcome, was I named as the sole responsible party. The thing about structural shifts is that they're permanent. Even if relationships recover, even if the company stabilizes, everyone in that room now understood the cost of assuming the quiet person would carry the weight. It wasn't anger that changed the system. It was a boundary. And once a boundary is visible, it cannot be unseen. They didn't lose everything. I didn't win anything. But something fundamental had changed. And there was no way to return to how it used to be. The confrontation, if you could call it that, happened weeks after mediation concluded. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no dramatic speeches. Just a conversation that had been waiting to occur. Daniel asked me to join him for coffee outside the office. Neutral ground. A quiet cafe a few blocks away where executives often went to talk freely. We sat across from each other near the window. Late afternoon light, no laptops, no legal pads. For a moment, we were just two professionals who had survived a difficult quarter. He stirred his coffee longer than necessary before speaking. "I've been thinking about how that situation unfolded," he began. I didn't interrupt. "We moved fast," he continued. "Too fast. And I think we relied on you to absorb more than we acknowledged." There it was. Not an apology exactly, but recognition. I held his gaze steady. "You relied on structure," I said calmly. "Structure allowed that allocation." He nodded slowly. "I didn't realize how exposed that made you." I considered that carefully before responding. "I did," I said. "No accusation, no sharpness, just truth." He exhaled quietly. "Why didn't you push harder?" It wasn't defensive. It was genuine. Because from his perspective, I had always been capable, intelligent, observant. Why stay quiet? "I did push," I replied, "in writing." He gave a faint, rueful smile. "Yes, you did." Silence settled between us, but not the old kind, not the kind that expected me to yield. This silence felt balanced. "I want you to know," he added, "it was never intentional." "I know," I said, and I meant it. That was the part people often misunderstand about these stories. There was no villain plotting in the background. There were incentives, momentum, ego, confidence, and a structure that made it easy to let the most stable person carry disproportionate risk. Mark never initiated a similar conversation, but his behavior changed. He became more precise in meetings. He stopped using my name as shorthand for execution ownership. He looped me into risk discussions earlier, not out of guilt, out of recalibration. The true confrontation wasn't emotional. It was structural, and it had already happened. The cafe conversation was simply an acknowledgement. Before we left, Daniel said something that lingered. "You're different now." I smiled slightly. "No," I replied. "I'm documented." He laughed quietly at that, but he understood. When you remove emotional heat from confrontation, what remains is clarity. And clarity doesn't attack. It defines. There was no victory speech, no final mic drop moment, just two people recognizing that a dynamic had shifted permanently. On the walk back to the office, I felt something unfamiliar. Not triumph, not resentment, equilibrium. For the first time since I joined the company, my competence was paired with boundaries. And that combination changes how people stand around you. They don't lean as casually. They don't assume as freely. They measure their words, not because they fear you, because they understand you, and understanding is quieter than intimidation, but far more durable. I'm still Riley. Same office, same black notebook, same calm tone in meetings. But the role has changed, because I changed. Not outwardly in dramatic ways. I didn't quit. I didn't demand a title overhaul. I didn't rebuild the company. I rebuilt my position inside it. There's a difference. Before, I believed value was proven through endurance, through absorbing pressure without complaint, through being the steady presence that allowed everyone else to move quickly. Now I understand something more precise. Value without boundary becomes convenience, and convenience is rarely protected. I no longer soften language to preserve comfort. If a clause assigns risk downward, I say so, plainly. If acceleration increases exposure, I document it. If responsibility needs clarification, I request it in writing before execution begins. Not as resistance, as alignment. The younger version of me thought alignment meant harmony. Now I know alignment means symmetry. If authority sits at the top, accountability must sit there too. I'm still calm, still measured, but my calmness is no longer accommodating. It's control. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can survive structural pressure without collapsing or lashing out. I don't replay the legal notice in my head anymore. I don't feel bitterness toward Daniel or Mark. In many ways, the company is healthier now. Governance tightened. Risk language clarified. Decision chains are documented properly. Ironically, I became more respected after I stopped trying to be agreeable. Not louder, not harsher, just clearer. There's a particular look people give you when they realize you won't absorb what isn't yours. It isn't fear, it's a recalculation, and recalculation is healthy. Personally, something shifted too. I no longer carry the unconscious belief that being indispensable guarantees safety. I maintain options. I nurture independence. I treat documentation as a form of self-respect. Because it is. The legal notice didn't destroy me. It refined me. It showed me the difference between loyalty and liability. It showed me that silence is only powerful when paired with structure. And most importantly, it showed me that you don't have to raise your voice to change the room. You only have to know where you stand. When I walk into meetings now, I don't sit at the far edge of the table. Not as a statement, just because that's no longer where my role belongs. I'm still not the loudest person in the room, but I am no longer the easiest place to land risk. And that shift, quiet, precise, irreversible, is the most powerful change I've ever made. When I opened that legal notice and saw my role positioned as the sole responsible party, something inside me went very still. Not because I was shocked, but because deep down I recognized the architecture. It hadn't been built in a single moment. It had been layered, meeting by meeting, softened sentence by softened sentence, one "it's fine" at a time. They signed the deal together, but made sure I would face the lawsuit alone. Not out of cruelty, out of convenience. And convenience is powerful when no one questions it. What changed my trajectory wasn't confrontation. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't a dramatic resignation or a public exposure. It was documentation. It was the decision to stop absorbing ambiguity. It was the realization that loyalty without boundaries slowly turns into silent liability. Here's what I learned. If you are the calm one, the reliable one, the person who always fixes what others overlook, you must be even more intentional about where responsibility officially rests. Because people don't always assign weight maliciously. Sometimes they simply let it settle where it has always settled before. And if you've been the steady surface long enough, it will settle on you. The shift doesn't require anger. It requires clarity. It requires language. It requires you to separate support from ownership, execution from authority, and agreement from silence. I didn't win anything extraordinary. The company survived. The executives recalibrated. The structure is corrected. But I walked away with something more durable than victory. I walked away with authorship of my own name, and that matters. So I want to leave you with this. Have you ever realized you were carrying responsibility that was never formally yours, simply because you were capable enough to handle it? If so, what would change if you stopped absorbing and started aligning? I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.